Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Breaking Bias Summit. And today I am so delighted to have a dear friend, Pádraig Tuama, with us. Welcome, Pádraig.
Thanks very much, Anu. Great to be with you.
If you don't know who he is a beautiful poet, storyteller, theologian, and a host of On Being's Poetry Unbound, and the author of Poetry Unbound, 50 Poems to Open Your World. His interests span language, violence, power, and religion. Feed the Beast is his most recent collection with Kitchen Hymns, a volume of original poems, and an essay poetry anthology, 40 poems on being with each other. And he has another book forthcoming in early 2025, a Poetry Unbound collection. So thank you so much, Pádraig, for being here with us.
My pleasure.
Part of our summit. One of the things I love to ask folks is, whenever people read bios about me, it makes me a little squeamish because it often lists all the things we do in the world. But I'd love to invite you to just share, who you be in the world, in your own words.
Well, I like reading. I like friends. I like cooking. I like traveling. Yeah, I think that kind of sums me up. Yeah, books, people, travel, food.
Yeah. And well, I'd love to learn a little bit more about and share with our audience a little bit about, just a biographical sketch of how you came to this work of poetry and theology, and particularly as a queer person, as a gay man in this world, Christian mysticism.
Well, we can debate Christian mysticism, and I'm happier with the term theology than I am with anything else. I grew up in a culture where poetry is everywhere. And our curriculum in school, from the age of 5 to 17, we were learning 2 poems off by heart every week, one in English, one in Irish. And so I've got most in common, I think, with Palestinian and Iranian friends when it comes to ordinary education. I wasn't in a private school, it was just the ordinary local school, ordinary education where poetry is suffused throughout. And lots of the poets that we studied were also people who had things to say about colonialism and British presence in Ireland. So to study art and to study history and to study language was to study society and to study power. So it all, in many ways, it was a very traditional education, learn everything off by heart and get the answers right. So it wasn't like it was this great kind of humanities experience, but the raw material of the data of poetry and the data of the lives of the individuals involved really did shape my curiosity. And speaking Irish and English, that also shaped me, to speak a language that isn't native to the country that you're in as the primary language in your own country is in itself a political education about what it is that language can do and how it is that such a drastic thing is achieved to change the mother tongue of a people. So that also is an education in war.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Like, one of the things I always think about is, language really gives us the limits of our imagination.
Yeah. And there's something about, there's something about being able to speak in the language that grew up in conversation with the landscape of the place where you're from, just learning local words for local things. That's always a dignity and a good thing. I like English. It's a great language. It's very versatile. It's filled with many things. So I'm very happy to speak English. And you can say in English what you can say in other languages too. But it isn't only because of individual languages' uniqueness that I think they should be preserved. It's just because they're from the place, and they modified. Certainly in Ireland, I can't speak scientifically about other places, but I'm sure it's mostly true that languages have modified because of shifting of power and decisions of people with power, with certain forms of power, to force language change. So that's a shame, because language is a repository of all kinds of elements of the soul of a people.
Yeah,
and then theology. I'm 48, so I grew up Catholic in a very Irish Catholic environment, and so it wasn't even about personal devotion. You just had to reckon with Catholicism to be growing up in the era that I was. Anyway, I think that's changed an enormous amount in Ireland now. but certainly you really did have to reckon with your thoughts about Catholicism and its teaching, and then Catholicism's relationship to Irishness, and then Catholicism as a marker of Irishness and Protestantism as a marker of Britishness. And both of those are theological affiliations that are read politically. Religion is never just a private affair, it's also a public and political one. So yeah, those things just entirely shaped my life. I'm absolutely a child of 1975 and onwards.
Well, this is so beautiful, because I was going to speak to you about the soul of a people, and given your history and your upbringing in Ireland, being of that 1975 generation, why is breaking bias important to you?
Well, one of the things I like about poetry is the element of surprise. And when you can be shocked by what it is that language can do, what language can unfold, it enlivens you. I mean, good comedy can do the same, where somebody says something, where you see something that you hadn't seen before. It might even be very mundane, but it opens you up. And it enlivens you to language's possibilities and to creative, generative possibilities. And that's fundamentally the artistic drive that I have when it comes to facing my own biases. Is I don't want to be caught in the endless repetition of a predictable script, and all of the defensiveness that comes about as a result of that, and all of the attacks that comes about as a result of that. I've been subject to receiving bias from other people, and I've also been subject to giving it to other people. And there's a way within which there's very little surprising in all of that, apart from the ways that we can wound and hurt each other systematically and seriously. That's not an unfolding kind of surprise. That's a degradation of surprise. I'm interested in changing my mind, because how interesting is that?
So interesting, right? To be able to change one's mind toward oneself and toward others. One of the things, I've so admired about you is your own coming out journey, being in this very Catholic Irish environment. And if you're willing to share, what was, and I'll share for myself, like as someone who grew up in an Indian culture in the US, but with fairly conservative parents, even though in their root tradition, which is Hindu and Buddhist in ways, there's nothing against homosexuality, right? A lot of that has been unwritten, but a lot of their perceptions are part of the colonial history, the British colonial history of South Asia. So they've really taken in those ideals. So I've had to fight that and really, look at myself as a second-class citizen until I was able to see that these were just stories. So what was that moment for you, that moment of reckoning, particularly when you're infused in an environment that is, in a way, degrades the existence of our being?
Yeah. I mean, it's crisis really that fueled it for me. I tried to find a way to ignore being gay. I mean, I knew I was. I know some people, it's a kind of a gradual awakening. For me, it was really clear from the age of puberty on to go, all right, I'm one of them. And I need to be really, really quiet. I need to learn how to lie. I need to learn how to fit in. I need to learn how to, all of the things that lots of people learn. So I just hoped it would go away. I was in, I suppose what you'd call an ecumenical, charismatic environment. I'll explain those terms. They're probably so insular. Ecumenical meaning people from different Christianities who are interested in working with each other. And some of those people many of them were very brave in terms of trying to address ongoing legacies of violence and British-Irish conflict in the north of Ireland. So I was with people who were genuinely doing some very interesting things. But it's fair to say that they absolutely believed in miracles and in the intervention of God, as they would have called it, to change a person's sexuality if they were afflicted with homosexuality. So I disclosed to some people that I was gay. Not that I use that term. The term was struggle with a homosexual orientation. And it's so cumbersome. It's terrible language.
It's terrible.
If something isn't beautiful in language, well, then it's unlikely to be beautiful in truth. Anyway, Anyway, they arranged some exorcisms for me. And then after those were unsuccessful, they arranged some what was called reparative therapy also. So I went to that for about 2 years. And that was all with the imagination that something was fundamentally flawed about everybody who was gay. And that somehow something had gone wrong. And all kinds of ridiculous causation stories were invented, which were usually misogynistic, which is at the heart, I think, of so much of these endeavors. Which, I mean, the story was that, you know, your father was probably out at work and your mother was probably a character. Right? Like, my God, that's the story of most of the world, most of Ireland. Like, if that was the case, you wouldn't have a heterosexual in Ireland. So, anyway. But these stories were terrible and they were really limiting. And the reparative therapist in particular was really interested in, he wanted me to fit in with the lads. There was question about, you know, maybe you could try a bit of soccer or try a bit of hurling or, you know, try these sports, try to jock it up a little bit, I suppose. Because the implication was that you were girlish if you were struggling with a homosexual orientation. And I like poetry, which probably just confirmed the fact. I definitely was in the clutches of the gay devils. So
the gay devil.
All of them, many of them, a whole legion of them. But he at one point said to me, he said, "Do you have any friends who are female?" And I said, "Yeah, plenty." And he said, "Well, I want you to look at them between now and next week and tell me which of them you would like to get to be sexually attracted to once you're cured, and tell me in what way you'd like to be sexually attracted to them." And I went back and I just thought, I'm not interested in doing that. So I went to him the next week and said, "I'm not interested in having the kind of sex that you seem to want me to have."
Yeah.
And he said, "You know what your problem is, Pádraig?" This is 100% quote. He said, "You know what your problem is? Your problem is language. You shouldn't want to have sex because have is a selfish verb. You should want to give sex." And I mean, struggle with a homosexual orientation was just, I already was thinking, this is stupid language. But the idea of saying, let's give sex rather than have sex, you can't say that in Irish. You don't conjugate sex with the verb to have in Irish. And anyway, the verb have and give in English are very particular conjugations. And I just thought, you're making all this shit up. This is terrible. And the whole thing fell apart. And I mean, of course, I had along the way thought, I don't know that this is true. I'm not sure that this is right. But it was just when he got to when the level of making stuff up got to the most inane and unimaginative, that something in me just thought, nah, this is just all made up. And I left. I got up and walked away and got the number 16 bus back to where I was living. I was living in a big religious, ecumenical Christian household. And I'd been told that unless I went to this reparative therapy, I'd have to leave, which was a big threat because I was living where I was working. And I walked around and just kept on saying to myself, I'm gay, I'm gay, I'm gay. And there was just, it wasn't that I loved the word, it was that I loved the simplicity to be able to just say, well, here's the truth. Yeah. And it was the truth that made me go, I don't know what to do now. And I was frightened by the truth and exhilarated by it too. And that was the first coming out, really. That was the first real one. I didn't know, it took years of very slowly talking to other people. It felt like confessing something terrible to them. Yes. But something powerful happened in that moment. That was an exorcism, really, when I was able to just realize, oh, there is devilish language happening and it's being forced upon me and I'm not interested in it.
Yeah. You had exercised yourself of all the socially conditioned devils that are propagated in our own minds, right? And you know, it's interesting when you say that you were repeating to yourself, I'm gay. You know, I had a similar, so I'm a late bloomer. I came out when I was 27. And I really count like when I came out to my parents and my family as like being fully public. And I had a moment, it was after a meditation retreat where I was deeply introspective around my own journey. And I was like, wow, I'm not proud to be gay. I'm actually honored. Like I kept on repeating that I'm honored to be gay. Like the spirit, the soul, this being has chosen consciously to appear in this body and manifest itself in this form. And something about your story was like, wow, like that was when you saw this deluded therapist, basically training you in misogyny, right?
Yeah,
He's
totally.
training you in
Exactly.
misogyny
Yeah,
to
yeah,
objectify other human beings who happen to be
totally.
women.
Yeah.
And yeah, so you were just like, this just does not comport with my value system.
Well, yeah, I didn't even know that. I just thought you're lying and you're making language up. And this, because I'd always written poetry, and poetry had been part of everything, and I loved good language. And this was terrible language,
Yeah.
and it couldn't be true if it was such terrible language. And if you're getting to the stage of saying "have" as a selfish verb, like, my God, like how ridiculous to anthropomorphize sounds that we make with our mouths. Like that, and to import virtue or the lack thereof to the verb have.
Yeah.
Just ridiculous.
And
It all
also,
fell apart.
and also just the ranking of oneself against others, right? This idea of selfishness, right, in there.
Oh, yeah.
So
Well, that's true. Yeah. I mean, the question is how are we focused on the self rather than are we? So often we do reckon with the self. It's one of the fundamental questions.
Yeah. Would you read us a poem?
Oh, sure. And many years after this experience with this particular therapist, I was in a place and I saw him at a meditation in a chapel. And initially I thought, oh my God, I'm not too happy to see him. And I found myself in kind of a second-long imaginary experience, finding myself in this beautiful cave, quiet, underground, with a very quiet pool of water, pure benevolence and soft time there. So I wrote this short poem many years later thinking about it. The poem is called Abomination. Abomination. Forgiveness? You can take it if you want it. Most days I practice forgetting the hold you once had on me. Mostly it works, most days. There's a cave I got to once while shaking in a corner of your chapel. When I found myself there, I forgot I was in your lair. The cave came to me and with me. I make my way there from time to time. It comes with no demand. I enter through the gate that has a sign that once said, danger.
So beautiful. And it's, one of the things that it activates in my being as I listen to it is this journey of noticing and becoming mindful of that gate, that cave that's dark and closed off, but choosing not to go in.
Yeah, well, I was told that cave was dangerous, and it wasn't. It actually was a place of home, to go into the ground. Jungians have a great time with my own unconscious, because I do have these repeated dreams and fantasies and fears about going into underground caves. What I like about that poem too is, and this comes to me not out of virtue, but out of poetic form, is like the poem starts off with the word forgiveness and offering it to say, well, he can have it if he wants it. My guess is that he's still very involved in such endeavors, and he would still think that he was doing right by trying to cure me. But I don't have much and all, as I, in public as well as private, do as much as I'm able to counteract reparative therapies or exorcisms of LGBT people. I'm also not interested in only defining him as that. He too was one of those people that was probably doing really interesting work regarding the ongoing legacy of Protestant Catholic British-Irish dialogue on the island of Ireland. I'm sure he was a good spouse and a good father, I'm uninterested in the worst story about him. I can't imagine that mine is the worst story, but it certainly isn't a good one. But I'm uninterested in that being the only story about him. And that forgiveness towards him is also an act of loosing myself from repeating an old story about him And to really, the most important part of that story is the cave I got to. And the fact that I've been told that cave is a sign that says danger, don't go there. And here's me, I found myself there. And actually it was a cave of benevolence and welcome once I was able to be in enough catastrophe to have to seek such safety.
You know, it's beautiful. And in a moment, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about forgiveness, because it's one of the pro-social behaviors that we can practice to really break bias. And what you've just described is that process of empathy, curiosity, awareness, and forgiveness.
Yeah.
But as you were sharing, one of my favorite quotes of Rumi's is, out beyond ideas of wrong and right, there's a field, and I'll meet you there. And it feels like this person was just caught up in these stories of right and wrong, that their imagination can't, is just stunted by what's possible for themselves. And because it's stunted for themselves, they can't offer others what they don't have themselves.
No,
right?
no,
Which is
I'm sure.
a sad part of bias. But how did forgiveness help you? And how did you even reach that place of forgiveness, particularly for someone who's caused such tremendous harm?
Well, I suppose I do tend to like the verb of forgiving rather than the kind of noun of forgiveness, which feels like it's been arrived at. Yeah, it happened. It's done. Complete. I forgave you 20 years ago.
I
forgot. Yeah.
Right.
My God. And we all know that you continually, that time comes in circles, and that you continually find yourself revisiting. And some days you wake up and you feel the pain that you thought that would no longer revisit you. And if you have an imagination of time only as linear, well, then that will feel like a failure. It's not. There's something for you in the attention that's being asked. Maybe you just need to recognize, oh, wow, that really did hurt or have an effect. Or maybe there's some other form of insight that the attention is drawing. Of course, this is obvious, and I know you've written about the caution about the word forgiving as well, that forgiving isn't excusing. Forgiving is, I love the etymology of the word pardon from French, pardonner, to give beyond, to exceed giving, to meta give. It's never about deserving, and it's certainly with some of the things in our lives, there is an understandable caution about using the word forgiveness, because it seems like you're just saying it didn't matter. Well, of course it did, but there's other things that matter too. My attention, my time, my resentment. Do I wake up in a rage every morning and spend the hours from 5 until 9 dwelling over something? Forgiveness will probably help if I can do that. But you can't rush that either, because certain wounds go very deep. I'm never interested in the idea of forgiving as the only good way to respond to a pain, because then it feels like, well, you can forgive or you can be bitter and die in bitterness. That's a very unhelpful thing. Part of me thinks, well, there has to be 3 or 4 or 5 positive ways to respond today. And that might be tell somebody, oh, I'm being visited by this pain again today. Finding a way to just maybe share the burden of it a little if you can, or to break yourself out of a self-involved cycle, or to seek justice. Maybe that's that's the endeavor that's called for. So there has to be there's all kinds of positive ways of responding to something that's wounded you, and forgiveness, if it's chosen freely and if you're safe enough to do so, isn't a bad one to have amidst the pile of good things. But I just like to see it as being amidst the pile.
It's so wonderful, and it reminds me that I years ago, when I was on my coming out journey and just kind of healing from a whole host of experiences I've had being brown man of color in the United States, and I went on a forgiveness retreat, and for 2 to 3 days straight, we were just in the Buddhist traditions, we were just repeating a lot of phrases around forgiveness. And I found that the place I needed to start with forgiveness was really with myself. And I couldn't offer it, because offering it to others was really, it felt like an instruction. It felt like an order, like to be a good person. But when I was able to really do that for myself, and I don't know if this resonates with you, but what was that process of self-forgiveness for you? And did it begin that day where you acknowledged, I am gay, you know, or...
First of all, I have an immediate association of times when somebody's come to me and said, I just really need to let you know that I've forgiven you now. You're like, oh God, I didn't know that I'd done something wrong. I mean, I'm not surprised that I did. So that's the first thing to say, is that forgiveness and its communication is a complex thing.
Yeah,
I'm sure I've done that to other people too. So anyway, but self-forgiveness, what do I think about that? It's not a term I use because it's not a term I use, but I suppose so much of it is about being able to look at yourself enough that you can not be consumed by looking at yourself, and all of the angst and regret and self-hatreds. In many ways, that's a form of attention that is addictive, and is like a fire that burns upon a fire. It's hard to put out, and I'm interested in making. I want to find a way to get beyond these things that just cause the vortex of question of self to just be released into something that can be in company of other things and focused on other endeavors that aren't just about my own personal pain, but that are about thinking about the wide world that we're in, the things that you can do to amplify and elevate what's happening in the world, you know?
Yes.
So that for me, I suppose something called self-forgiveness and something called something else, they're all trying to do the same thing, which is to learn how to live enough with yourself in the world that you can try to be generous and act justly, and to be alert to the circumstances in the world that are needing attention, needing money, needing fundraising, needing whatever, you know.
What does justice mean to you? Because
well, I see justice as a field. And on that field, there are many corners, a many cornered field. There's the field of human encounter. If you think of different groups that have been alienated from each other, so relationship building, that's one corner of the field. Telling the truth about history is another corner of the field. Economic reparation is another corner of the field. Educational reform is another corner of the field. Policy change at governmental level is another corner of the field. And for me, justice is about finding a way with it where the web and criminal justice is absolutely part of that field too.
yes.
Finding a way where the web of all of these things can be held in a way where people involved in such endeavors are collaborating with each other, with their own emphases and with their own tensions, but not in a way where any one of those things is asserting its pure and simple dominance over all of the others. I think the arts are part of that too. And people saying, I want to talk about the environment, you know, in terms of that. I think about what's happening in Gaza. And one of the things I see is that different people, as public conversation is raising about what's going on, have different emphases. And one of the things I fear is that in people who are giving a lot of attention and love and solidarity and public voice to what's happening in Gaza, that somebody might, or some forces might wish to create the divide and conquer dynamic in the community, to say, well, okay, you want to do policy reform, you want to do some compromise, you want to do some this, you want to do this and that, you know, none of you agree with each other, and so to shake up the jar, that like a jar of angry bees, and say, see, it's all self-defeating because they can't agree. Of course they can't agree. Justice is that field of many corners, and it has to be held with tension. And one of the things that I think is involved in being part of a justice community is to be conflict intelligent and not to be manipulated by forces that have no interest in being moved towards change by exacerbating existing tensions within the community of justice.
Yeah, so beautiful to be conflict intelligent around, you know, what you listed are the root causes of bias, you know, policies, stories, media, education, you know,
trauma,
social
I'm sure
relations.
I left out loads.
Yeah, social relations. And, you know, as you witness what's happening in our world, and I know you've been part of some reconciliation processes in Ireland, And would love for you to speak to that a little bit, what you observed in that process. And also perhaps for some of our viewers and listeners who are not educated on this, the difference between the north of Ireland versus Northern Ireland. I
Oh,
remember
God.
you educated me on this when we met, a few years ago when we met in person.
Well, I'll start with the latter. It is so self-involved. If you're a foreigner, call it what you want. But so this thing called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was created in an Act of Union in 1801 or so. That was not created by referendum. Ireland was suddenly part of this thing called the United Kingdom, the whole of Ireland. And there had been a British presence in Ireland for centuries already by that stage, where the English language had been enforced in certain policies. And there was a desire for independence. And around 1916, so around 100 years later, that culminated in a revolution, a short-lived and failure of a revolution. There was a number of poets involved in staging that revolution. They were summarily executed within a few days by the British government. And that actually ignited a fire around Ireland. It was the summary execution of people they didn't have the public sympathy for their timing, but after their execution, they were like, this is just an act of war, and so World War I had just broken out. So Ireland was, the British government said, I'm being crude here with timing and words, but essentially said, okay, independence will be guaranteed, but we need to sort out this thing, which we now call World War I first. A terrible thing. Anyway, Ireland was granted partial independence in 1921 because the British had had a system, like in lots of places, of planting loyal subjects who happened to be Protestant in the north of Ireland and giving them land, which then meant that you had a lot of Protestant British landowners in the north of Ireland with working class poorer Catholics. Now, you actually did also have a lot of working class poor Protestants as well in the north of Ireland. The British government, they drew a border around the majority Protestant area in the north of Ireland, some of whom had been there for hundreds of years. They were local by that stage, but they can still consider themselves British and were still practicing the Protestant religion, even by affiliation. So this new state called Northern Ireland was a British state for a British people, a British statelet for a British people, a Protestant state for a Protestant people in the northeast corner of Ireland, 6 counties. And so the British call it Northern Ireland. And lots of, I'm an Irish nationalist, lots of us would tend to, as far as possible, just call it the North or the north of Ireland, because there's a way within which I'm not a foreigner when I'm in Belfast, So, and Britain talks about the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. And I feel like, what's that supposed to leave me? I live in the north, but I'm not born there. And I speak the language of the etymology of all of the place names. Yeah. So, I think for lots of us, you often find that, even as people were talking about Ukraine over the last number of years, in some places, there was a lot of people who were saying the Ukraine, referring to that. And that particularly comes from a Russian way of referring to that territory, to that country. And so quickly enough, people were saying that's actually more sensitive in English if you just say Ukraine rather than the Ukraine. And these seem like tiny differences, but for any people like me who come from a place where you are looking to go, actually, we want to use language where we recognize the place where we're in, it matters. You want to use. Of course, part of the whole process of peace in the north of Ireland is the fact that I recognize we have this thing called parity of esteem. It's absolutely, there's full esteem for people like me who would vote tomorrow for a reunified Ireland. I have to extend that too to people who would vote tomorrow for Northern Ireland to remain one of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, and what we have to do is to find a way through democratic and convincing means to be in dialogue with each other and to create the kind of society that no matter what the outcome of such a vote would be, that somehow we can live with each other. Because one thing that is guaranteed in such a vote is that some people will not be happy with the outcome. And what we have to find is a way not to murder each other. In the name of whatever it is, whatever shape of nationality or sovereignty it is that we seek to find. So that's part behind it. The projects that I've been involved with over the years, they've been a whole variety. Sometimes it's been researching minority community experiences of living in a border town. So it might be that there's a town where there's minority of Catholic Irish people and a large majority of British Protestant people. So to seek out interviews to then make recommendations to the local borough council to say, well, here's ways within which the paraphernalia or the organization of the public language about this town can be better improved. For lots of time, I met with people from 2 neighboring villages where there had been a murder between the 2 villages, and the community relations that had been established between these 2 villages, one of which was majority Irish Catholic, the other majority British Protestant. A lot of the trust that had been built up over years was decimated as a result of the trauma of this terrible murder. And so to be involved on a weekly level to do, I suppose, what we call mediative discourse in this situation. Other times I've worked with people who've been actors in bearing arms. They might have done that through a paramilitary organization. They might have done that through a police service, but who are meeting with each other to talk about the ongoing impact of the question of that people have died as a result of their actions. And some people will say, no, I was serving my country, it's fine. Other people will say, no, I was involved in a murder, and figuring out the way that people talk about all of those things. Sometimes it's meeting between victims, family, the families who've been bereaved, or somebody who's been injured, with somebody who comes from the organization that was the perpetuating force of that injury or bereavement. And finding ways where people can share the same room with each other and ask questions of each other. In general, you're not trying to say, oh, it doesn't matter, of course, you're not saying that. But you're also not trying to say, let's all be great friends. Typically, people have a curiosity that they want to put something to rest. They want to say finally to someone, or ask a question, or hear something, or humanize somebody, or find a way where they can somehow be jolted into seeing their own perspective from a new point of view. Different people come with different motivations in that, and there's all kinds of ways in which you establish different measures of safety and measures also of success for all of that. People who come to those events are the leaders of it, really, because they are coming with the desire to do it. You can't ever force, and nor would I want anybody to come into such a room. But if people do come to such a room, well, then I'm really interested to say, what brings you here? And to not imagine that I automatically comprehend it. And to create a situation where we can explore that together.
Yeah, it's so beautiful, because what you're describing is the work of breaking bias, right? Because bias is a learned habit that distorts how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. And for people across the spectrum, right, on both and many other sides, there are these learned habits of perceiving the other a certain way, and how do we overcome these stories that have so informed our own perceptions of others, ourselves and others. But then ultimately, how do we address the pain that we feel for being identified with certain identities? And the more I listen to you, the more I'm like, well, this is the same story in the former Yugoslavia, whether it's Croatia or Serbia or Bosnia, or my ancestors in Punjab, right? All ethnically Punjabi, but because of religious differences, so much bloodshed to what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and Gaza, to different places in the world. And this feels like, like as a theologian, like, how do you feel about this moment? I feel like we're repeating the same mistakes that our ancestors made in a way. Or do you feel any sense of hopefulness?
Well, we are in a time of returning, aren't we? And not in a way that feels fruitful. There's a line from a poem by W.B. Yeats, a great Anglo-Irish poet, called The Second Coming, and he says, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And he speaks about being a time when the best lack all conviction. And he wrote it 100 years ago, but reading it now, you feel like, oh my God, he was tapping into something that is kind of a circular, cyclical thing. And the question is what to do in the midst of that, not to sit back and just think, oh, time is repeating itself, therefore you just got to wait through a few, miserable decades. That's a luxury that I can grant myself, but other people don't have the luxury of staying alive in order to be able to grant themselves. So what can we do? I don't know. Often what we can do feels very minor. I think it is, to amplify. That might be amplifying funds, amplifying awareness, amplifying protest, amplifying causes for justice. I think it can too be that mix, that complicated mix of calling out terrible policies, as well as providing a way where people who might not see things as they should be can have a pathway into change and reform, rather than thinking you're the devil, because that's usually unlikely to help change. Shame. I mean, shame gets a bad rap these days, and I don't think that shame is always a terrible thing. There's certain, when I look at the Irish diaspora in the Caribbean, for instance, I feel shame at what it was that people who had been treated abominably by the British Empire in Ireland, they were taken as indentured servants to the Caribbean for 7 or 14 years, but then they were given freedom from being an indentured servant with a plot of land sometimes. And within a generation or two, they were exacerbating the very same projects towards enslaved people and indigenous people in the Caribbean that their previous overlords have been doing. And I look at that and just feel like, my God, I wish that it were that the suffering of Irish people would have meant that Irish people would not have caused such suffering elsewhere. But it is an awful truth that suffering people are perfectly capable, unfortunately, of further perpetuating suffering elsewhere. I wish that were not the case, but it is not true. And I think Ireland is a salutary example of that. Of course, you can find some nice examples of Irish people who learned indigenous languages in one place or another, or part of causes of justice, but mostly they were poor people who wanted a bit of land and actually had the cognitive dissonance to go, okay, I'm going to do here what was done to us. That's terrible. And I'm assuming that were I in that situation, I would have done the same thing. I don't want to disenfranchise myself from them to say I never would have done it. My guess is that if the same amount of cowardice encourages them, that I would have been very recognizable there. But the hope is to find some way to confess that, to recognize it, in the hope that in whatever way I can stop it myself.
Exactly. And there are many, many examples of abolitionists who were of Irish descent, John Brown being one of them, who, so many people in the Indian independence movement of Irish descent. And it's, it's both and though, right? That doesn't say that there weren't folks on the other side. And, Grace Lee Boggs had this quote that, oftentimes in history, yesterday's oppressed become today's oppressors, right? Because ultimately people are people, humans are humans across the spectrum, right? Regardless of what's happened to us. But this, brings me to kind of like one of the last questions I have for you before I'd love to invite you to read another poem, which is, what's the role of love in all of this, in breaking bias?
Well, love is also a field, I know.
Yes,
a field of many corners.
I knew that. Okay, let's talk about this field of love.
What is the field of love? Some of it is about creating an environment where people can live because they're being murdered. That's an act of love. I saw a clip the other week of kids in Gaza where maybe like some 8-year-olds had a length of rope and were holding it and swinging it so that some 4-year-olds could jump rope. And I thought, I bet you those 8-year-olds know exactly what they're doing, which is to say, we're giving the young ones a bit of a break. And I thought, my God, what love, what terror, what world we're in, And I thought the self-sacrificing consideration of those 8-year-olds to make a little world of play for 30 seconds or 2 minutes for those 4-year-olds. Bloody hell. That's love.
That's love.
To create a temporary fiction for a while. I don't want to live in a world where that's necessary, but I do. I'd like to live it. Love is also doing everything we can in all of the conflict zones around the world to create a situation where people don't have to create such escapist fictions, because the world is such a terrible place in many places. I think that's love. Making is love. It's easier to break something than to make something. Often in conflict resolution, I find that people are you're trained in when you're training in conflict mediation to recognize that sometimes just before resolution is arrived at, somebody will pretty much pull the rug from underneath the feet of everyone.
Yeah.
And to recognize that for some people, the crisis of arrival at something is too hard to cope with. And they'd much rather face back to the conflict they know than the nascent, soon to be born naivety of how can we maintain something that actually might be good. That can be a very vulnerable thing to do. And so love, I think, is learning how to make, and learning how to make small things, and learning how to cope with the fact that nothing is perfect when it's small, but it's still a good idea to try. Love is friendship. Love is curiosity. Love is time by yourself. Love is all the things. Love is good food. Love is, reading a good book. Love is all of that. But I also think that love in policy is, it's not like everybody's going to love everybody. Of course not. But what I would want is policy that allows for the fact that let's have a society where people can enjoy love with each other. And that means a policy where people are free to move, a policy where people have the capacity to be educated, where people are not so consumed with worry about healthcare that they neglect their own health. That too is providing the kind of underground stream upon which that can nurture love, and that is the relationship, I think, between policy and love is about good governance. To think, are the decisions we're making for prosperity, for change, for improvement? It's not that everybody, I'm not proposing that everybody earns everything the same, but I am thinking, does the system have enough support such that there can be the provision of love for people in the community? That's how I think about how love should influence the way that we think about the world.
Love that. And I love that because it's really what you're describing and depicting for us is really a world without bias, right? Where we've overcome these separation systems we've erected within ourselves and without ourselves in the world around us.
Yeah.
Would you share a poem with us as we come
sure.
to a close?
And there's a tradition in Ireland and many other places too about praying for your own death. And these are old poems that are, that emerged from people, many of whom didn't write, they just composed and then memorized these prayers. And they knew that death could be around the corner because of occupation, because of impoverishment, because of starvation. So I've thought about that for a long time in terms of what does it mean, not in a luxurious way, but in a way that alerts you to what's important, to pay attention to death. So here is a poem called How to Be Alone. That is in line of that.
Beautiful.
How to be alone. It all begins with knowing nothing lasts forever. So you might as well start packing now. In the meantime, practice being alive. There will be a party where you'll feel like nobody's paying you attention. And there will be a party where attention's all you'll get. What you need to do is to remember to talk to yourself between these parties. And again, there will be a day, a decade, where you won't fit in with your body, even though you're in the only body you're in. You need to control your habit of forgetting to breathe. Remember when you were younger and you practiced kissing on your arm? You were onto something then. Sometimes harm knows its own healing. Comfort knows its own intelligence. Kindness too, it needs no reason. There is a you telling you another story of you. Listen to her. Where do you feel anxiety in your body? The chest, the fist, the dream before waking, the head that feels like it's at the top of the swing, or the clutch of gut, like falling and falling and falling and falling. It knows something. You're dying. Try to stay alive. For now, touch yourself. I'm serious. Touch yourself. Take your hand and place your hand someplace upon your body and listen to the community of madness that you are. You are such an interesting conversation. You belong here.
Amen. You belong here. Such an interesting conversation. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, dear Pádraig, for being with
Pleasure,
us.
Anu. Thanks for
Do you have any closing words for those of us listening and so moved by this last poem?
Well, it's a reflection on you, Anu. One of the things I admire so much about your book and admire about your work is that there can be this binary, really, that to face the devastating things like systemic bias, that you need to go into that with the same level of energy, and that helps. Again, it's a field. What you do is you speak warmly and with articulation about the field where you can bring mindfulness in, the field where gentleness and conversation about serious, devastating things like bias can be in conversation with each other, and that isn't an opt-out, and it's not a both-siderism or a flaccid middle ground. You do that with conviction and courage, and I think that that's a really important voice to have in the field of all of the responses to the question of bias. We need, I mean, I'm a big fan of, I suppose, positive discrimination, or it's called different things in other ways, in terms of meeting quotas at workplaces. You hope to get beyond them, but they can help to reset something. There's all kinds of ways to go about different things. They're all in that wide room of conversation, but so is bringing the heart, bringing mindfulness, bringing gentleness, bringing consideration into the conversation. That is as powerful and courageous as all of the other approaches. And I really like how you do that. I think it's necessary. I think I have a natural tendency towards that. One of the things I needed to do was to learn how to be assertive in order to be able to come back to a natural tendency towards curiosity.
Oh, well, thank you so much for that. And I know that we're kindred spirits on this journey together. So I'm just so grateful for your time and all the words that you put out in the world to inspire and energize people like me. So
thanks, Anu. So good to know you.
Likewise. Thank you.